It seems to me that a cultural shift in Western democracies has occurred. The zeitgeist of our times is a rejection of the far left lunacies imposed primarily upon societies and a return to rationalism. But how much progress has been made, and what are some of the achievements we should expect to see in 2025? Two distinguished guests join me to discuss these issues within the areas of women's rights and gender ideology. Katrina Biggs is a prominent social commentator whose writings on the subject of gender issues are prolific and broadly read and highly regarded. Jill Ovens is a trade unionist, serving as co-leader of the Midwives Trade Union. Aghast at the erasure of women by the forces of the left, she resigned from the Labour Party and founded the Women's Rights Party. Good afternoon, ladies.
Good afternoon, Simon.
Hi, Simon.
Starting with you, Katrina, what were the highlights and lowlights that stood out for you in 2024?
Well, the highlights, I think, came more like towards the end of the year when we started to see some pushback happening against gender ideology. And I think it was happening already, but I think once Trump got elected, it seemed to be that people felt almost like they could breathe again and started actually sort of saying more about what was on their mind, things that they were hesitant to say beforehand in case they got censored or cancelled. I mean, the cancellations started to become a little bit fewer, but, they were still there. So that was something that seemed to happen. And I noticed that when Sal Grover came to New Zealand and she came to Christchurch, I noticed a difference in the audience at that stage as well, compared to like 3 years ago when Speak Up for Women were touring the country against sex self-ID. And the audience at that time was very, what the heck's going on type of thing, confused. And this time the audience was a lot more along the lines of, we're not having this. So there was that kind of vibe change that you could feel. But I think people are still confused about what they can actually do. So there are good things I can see sort of happening. You can sort of feel the social change and stuff like that. But sort of on the downside, gender ideology has still been entrenched into policies now. And it's going to be very hard to prise it out of there. We could see that in the language being used in Health New Zealand, in the Law Commission review, and that sort of thing. So they're my two takes on last year, and I think that, but I get the feeling too that people are much more willing to collaborate as well on the issues that they agree with, and put differences aside. I can see more and more of that happening. So that's a good thing, and I think that will continue into this year, and it'll gain momentum.
Well, I hope you're right. And turning to you, Jill, what are the primary issues that you would like to see resolved in 2025?
Well, 2025 is when the Law Commission's review will actually go to Parliament, which could see gender identity and expression being included in the Human Rights Act. And so that's due to happen about the middle of the year in June. That is going to be quite a big one to fight off, because I think that as Katrina said, the Law Commission was very much in favour of including gender identity and expression on the basis that people needed to have protection against discrimination. But I think some of the grounds that they were suggesting were not real, in fact. And the other thing that's happening in 2025 very soon, on the 20th of January, is the submissions closing on the regulation of puberty blockers for children. And so that is also going to be continuing because it needs to go through Parliament yet. So there's plenty of opportunity to comment on that. So it's been a pretty busy parliamentary schedule in the past year since the new coalition government was elected. But I think in 2024 there was some frustration at the lack of progress on the key issues which New Zealand First fought on, which was about protection of women's spaces and protection of women's sports. And there was quite a bit of frustration about the progress in those two regards.
And right, would it be fair to say that the consensus of our discussion is that we would like to see some runs on the board, some achievements, some policy changes from the coalition government in 2025? Would that be a fair synopsis?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, don't forget it is a coalition. I don't think the National Party is very keen to go very far on these issues. Don't forget that Christopher Luxon thought that it was lunacy to think that women needed protection in terms of bathrooms, toilets before the election. And the other thing is that remember that Winston's stepping down as Deputy Prime Minister shortly to hand over the reins to Simon Bridges.
No.
Seymour.
Right, Simon?
Yeah, David Seymour.
David Seymour, yeah. Sorry about that. David Seymour. And David Seymour, with his libertarian hat on, doesn't necessarily always see alignment with ourselves. For example, the ACT Party brought in the surrogacy, proposed surrogacy relaxation that had been sought previously by Tamati Coffey from the Labour Party. They didn't need to do that. It had passed its first reading, but the new government didn't need to pick it up. In fact, they did, and the ACT Party is the one that picked it up. So I don't know that having David Seymour in such a prominent position as the Deputy Prime Minister will necessarily see us achieving all of our goals.
All right. Well, that's very interesting, and I think it's fair to say all round that we want to see a little bit, a few more runs on the board. But there's also the fact of the pressure that that our politicians are coming under from the vested interests, and by that I just don't mean the rainbow organisations, but I also mean groups like the trade unions and even their own bureaucracy. And a good example of that is the Law Commission. And I'll bring up that you mentioned just a few moments ago, Jill. And this is talking about protecting for gender expression to become a protected characteristic in under the Human Rights Act, if I'm to understand correctly. Is that right?
Yep. Yes.
All right.
We already have sex. And we already have sexual orientation. And there is an argument that gender identity is already protected. That's what the Crown Law opinion was years ago. That's rather dubious too. But, in many respects, I'd like to see what real discrimination does occur for people with different gender identities and how that impacts on women and women's rights. For example,
I think that's the key issue. I think that's the key issue. And Katrina, don't you think it's really what this initiative is about blurring the lines and redefining women in legislation?
I really think it's about blurring the line about what women are allowed to have, and I will refer to the Christchurch City Council on this, and they've recently implemented an equity and inclusion policy. And I campaigned with some other women for them to include the word sex in there, because they had the word gender and a few other categories that were going to be all in part of this equity and inclusion, but they didn't have the word sex in there. And they were adamant. They absolutely refused to do it. And when I saw, I actually sort of found, how the councils record their meetings, and looked at this recording of when they discussed this bill, this policy for passing in a council meeting. And the woman driving it, Councillor Sarah Templeton, she was asked to address a couple of concerns from the councillors. And she actually sort of said that gender and sex are not the same, but can be used interchangeably, basically as the Human Rights Commission does. So she was stating that she's okay to conflate those two things. And she just would not have the word sex in there. And it became really obvious because of what she said further to that, was that she considered the word sex to be a threat to the word gender, because contestable to the word gender. And whereas if the sex was in there, some woman might be able to come along and say, what about our sex-based rights? And then, the men who say they're women may not win that contest. So she wanted gender to be in there so that you could muddy the waters, basically.
And which political party does this councillor represent, Katrina?
I don't know. I've heard someone say the Greens. She's in the Greens, but that's hearsay. I don't actually know. I'd have to check it out.
But that would fit, isn't it? It's because the left-wing political parties are really welded on to gender ideology and queer theory, and we're seeing this permeate throughout the public sector and at national level and very much at local level. And Jill, I understand that the Women's Rights Party is looking to actually get involved in local politics and maybe even running for local body elections this year.
We're just talking about the Wellington Mayoralty to put up a challenge to Tory whānau and the green capture in what we call Wokington. So everybody was really keen to stand a mayoral candidate, but everybody was pointing at everybody else to be the one to stand. Yeah. And of course, I'm an Aucklander, so I'm ruled out. So that's the only one that we could see the value in. We think there's going to be a lot of media focus on Wokington, and that's our thinking around the local body elections. People don't usually stand necessarily in local body elections in terms of political party affiliations. We do in Auckland, but I don't think that's the case so much, is it, in Christchurch, Katrina?
No, I don't think so. Councillors just basically stand on, it's almost like independently, and just stand for their... they put out some blurb about what they stand for, what they're going to do, and stuff like that. And this councillor, Sarah Templeton, she has thrown her hat in the ring. She's already said she's going to contest the mayoralty at the next elections. So we'd like someone here just to stand up against her. I mean, I think the mayor, Major, what's his? I can't remember his first name now. I think he is going to stand again. I haven't heard that he's not going to, but so far no one else has thrown their hat in the ring to stand for mayor. So if it's her, oh boy.
Well, good luck to you both. I think that this is one of the issues that we have in local government, that they are just absolutely captured by this ideology, and they face very little pushback, and just seem to get on and do what they choose, and they listen to activists rather from the community on these issues. A good example is in Christchurch, where I understand, as you say, Katrina, that effectively male access to women's spaces, it's just the way things are done there now. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically the policies that the Christchurch City Council have implemented and basically cemented with this equity and inclusion policy mean that female spaces in any council-owned venue have now been, the control of them have now been put into the hands of men, because all a man has to say is that he's a woman and he gets into these spaces. Now, he might choose, a lot of men will choose not to say that, but the choice is in their hands. They get to choose whether they say they're women or not and come into those spaces. And the council don't see a problem with that. unless a woman gets physically attacked or hurt or something, they don't see a problem with it.
No,
Which
exactly
has
right.
happened in Timaru. They
Yeah.
had a case of a man perving on women in the women's bathrooms, changing rooms, and that went to court. So there have been some cases that end up going to court. And
Was
so
that
it is a real...
was that a unisex cubicle that happened in though? I'm talking about communal sort of spaces, women's spaces, and swim sessions and stuff like that.
Ladies, I would suggest to you that it's the same broad social trend as we're seeing the United Kingdom's Labour Party grapple with at the moment, with the rape gang scandal that's going on, where you have left-wing politicians who are so welded to these ideologies that the rights of women and girls, and in Great Britain, it was very, very young children, can be sacrificed upon the altar of this ideology. In Great Britain, the choice between protecting young girls or maintaining good inter-community relations, the Labour Party chose the latter. A similar sort of thing is happening in our councils. There's another article another definition I wanted to discuss with you, because we mentioned the Human Rights Commission, and I'm talking about this in relation to councils like Christchurch City Council, where there really is very few avenues to get the decisions that they make reviewed. And a good example of that is the Human Rights Commission, which nominally is a Quango/NGO/GO that is involved in maintaining and upholding the rights of New Zealanders. But in point of fact, they are an entirely captured organisation as well. And I look here on their main website, and I'll just read to you the quote of what they say. It says, rights of sexual and gender minorities. And their assertion here is, it is unlawful to discriminate against someone because of their sexual orientation or sex, including their gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. Now, that is actually untrue, is it not?
That's right. That's right. I mean, it goes back to 2006 when Crown Law was asked to make an opinion on this. And they came out saying that gender identity is covered under the umbrella of sex. It isn't, of course. But since then, right throughout the government sector, the public sector, and to a certain extent the private sector, employers have implemented policies to protect the rights of transgender employees, including their right of access to the toilets or facilities that match their gender, and completely ignoring, without any consultation with the women employees. And so we're actually involved in a case that's going to the Human Rights Tribunal in March, where the rights of the women employees have been completely trampled upon, and the employee concerned, when she raised concerns, was told to basically harden up and get on with it and stop being so bigoted. So that's the attitude that you get, and it's all through. I should say that I'm no longer a co-leader of the Midwives Union because I retired last year, but I've been involved in the union movement for 36 years, and so it came as quite a surprise to me around 2018, 2019, where at the level of the Council of Trade Unions, when we were considering the strategic plan, the equity session did not mention women. And when I raised this, I noticed that there was a category, people of different gender identities, and I said, surely you don't mean to say include women as people of different gender identities. Anyway, the final version didn't have all that, but the reality is that there is a lot of confusion, as you say, Katrina, in that we have used the terms in the past interchangeably, gender and sex. But, and that partly is attributed to people's association of sex with sexual intercourse, and therefore gender was a more acceptable term. And it's still quite often used interchangeably by feminists throughout the world. but it's not the same thing, and they're completely ignoring any of the wishes of women.
Which is really astonishing. But I'm absolutely aghast that an organisation like the Human Rights Commission could have something like this on the website, which is just simply untrue. They are making up the laws of this country unilaterally, with no review, no instruction from Parliament to do so. There are activists inside this organisation, which is really critical for upholding human rights, that is simply pushing an ideology that is not supported by any act of Parliament or by a general mandate from the people. Does that strike either of you as being outrageous?
It is outrageous, and you'll find that in other documents too, distributed by the government. There is a website called Employment New Zealand, which is the official advice for employers and employees on matters in relation to employment, obviously. And there is a section on transgender employees' rights, and it makes the same sort of statement. It's absolutely throughout the public service. It has its origins going back to that 2006 Crown Law decision.
Yeah, and I would also say that the Human Rights Commission, they've got also a webpage about community activities or something like that. And the way that they word it is really, really clever. The way they word it, and all about, you're not allowed to discriminate against people because of their gender, etc., makes anyone reading it who might be a service provider think that they cannot apply a single-sex space anymore. As I said, it's really cleverly worded. If you read it without knowing that you've got to sort of read between the lines, you would be convinced that you cannot provide a single-sex space anymore.
And if you go to the Human Rights Act and you Google the word gender, you won't find it. It's not there.
No.
And there is a section in the Human Rights Act which allows for providers of services to the public to have discrimination on the basis of sex. So you can have single-sex spaces.
Yeah,
which is as right and proper.
The lawyer for the Christchurch City Council, actually, in the same video I was talking about before, watching the council meeting, she actually told them that gender was in the Human Rights Act. She told the councillors that. She gave them incorrect advice. And I'm not going to, I'm not going to say she lied deliberately, but she gave them incorrect advice because, as Jill just said, the word gender is not in the Human Rights Act. But here is their lawyer told them it was. So that was giving justification for putting it into this policy.
So the reason we brought Sal Grover over to New Zealand, to tour New Zealand at the time that we did in the middle of last year, when the Law Commission was looking at the issue about putting gender identity and expression into our Human Rights Act, is because they did that in Australia in 2013 under the Julia Gillard government. And it's what's led them to this position where they don't know what a woman is. So in the Tickle versus Google case, where there was a clear reason for the app that was developed by Sal Grover for women only, because they were discussing things like flatting together or other issues that women would share with each other, and they wanted to exclude men. And they didn't say they wanted to exclude men who identify as women, they wanted to exclude men. And that right was ruled against, and they now have to go to appeal. But we brought Sal over because it was a complete example of what will happen if we put gender identity and expression, and it's pretty much the same words that's in the Australian Act that they're wanting to put into the New Zealand one.
Yeah, of course. Well, they're singing off the same choir sheet, aren't they? And it's because it's these people are organized. They have their strategies, they have their tactics, and they're looking to impose all of the sorts of similar legislation from country to country. So we just see it being repeated. And one of my personal
do
hopes,
we see this? Do we see this coalition government opposing that? And let's see what happens when it comes to Parliament. But I have my doubts. I think it will go through.
Well, and I share them. But moving along, there was another article that I thought was really interesting today, that I saw Katrina share on social media, and this was a very interesting op-ed in the New Zealand Herald from Dr. Charlotte Hall from Otago University, where I understand she's an epidemiologist, speaking about puberty blockers. Now, I think everyone is aware of the Cass report and how the United Kingdom, amongst many European countries, has realized that the prescription of these drugs is dangerous and often inappropriate. Conversely, in New Zealand, they've been handing them out. Doctors, and particularly those inside captured gender clinics, have been handing them out to children like they are candy, something like between 7 and 11 times the prescription rate as was happening inside the United Kingdom until there was a ban. Now, there has been a review, and New Zealand has not banned them. What are your thoughts, Katrina, on Dr. Paul's article and the prescription of puberty blockers and the controls around it?
Well, one of the things that stood out for me in her article, I mean, it was brilliant. It was just very concise, very to the point, nothing contentious in it really, apart from the fact that it says that, you know, that puberty blockers should not be getting handed out like this. But she made a really good point, I thought, that she said that we've been moving more and more, you know, in the I think she was talking about medicine here, more and more towards giving people medicines and, you know, puberty blockers on a rights-based need or rights-based process instead of an evidence-based process. And I think that she encapsulated that very well for a lot of things, is that we've got this real focus now on rights-based instead of reality-based or needs-based or evidence-based. So that, I thought that was a very good point she made there.
I did too, and this is precisely the case. The rights-based rather than the evidence-based interest approach has been at the forefront in New Zealand. It breaches medical council standards. Of course, there are no consequences for breaching medical council standards, but these doctors have been doing it anyway. Jill, does the Women's Rights Party take a view on the puberty blockers discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a very strong statement calling for a ban on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for children and adolescents. So we don't, for the use of gender-related distress, because there are other uses for puberty blockers which are, you know, legitimate, such as precocious puberty. But so we totally think that it's an issue about consent, that young people cannot give consent. We don't allow young people to drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes. In Australia, they're going to not allow them to watch social media. I think that's a good thing too, because I think that is lying behind a lot of what's happening, particularly with young girls, in terms of gender identity. It's become a fad.
A social contagion.
Absolutely, just like previous ones, like self-harming and cutting.
Yeah.
And one of the most bizarre things that happened this year was when a young woman attempted to cut off her own breast, and she used YouTube videos to show her how to do it. And it ended up in disaster, and she had to go to hospital and have emergency surgery, which resulted in double mastectomy, so she'll never be able to breastfeed a baby.
Well, see, that's absolutely terrible, and I certainly believe that the medical profession deserves their share of culpability, and I would like to see some accountability in that regard. And which brings me to what is going on with the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, and I'll bring that article up now because it just doesn't. It isn't just actual general practitioners who are having this ideology pushed upon them. It is also psychiatrists and psychologists, to the degree that the Royal College mandated that affirmation is the only suitable treatment for children's gender dysphoria. And of course, a huge number of psychiatrists were absolutely outraged that they were being mandated to a particular treatment path. Psychiatrists that I have spoken to have told me that they are keeping their heads down, trying not to address this issue because they are worried about the professional consequences of speaking out against something that they think is incorrect. However, there was a letter published by some of the psychiatrists in this part of the world in response to the Cass report. And I'll read a bit of it to you now. It reads, a letter from RANZ CP members, Cass Review final report. As RANZ CP members, we believe our serious professional concerns regarding the gender interventions being provided to Australian children and adolescents are not being adequately represented by the college in its media communications and political advocacy. The Cass Review final report was released, commissioned by the UK's NHS. The report conducted 8 independent systematic reviews of the global research literature to underpin its recommendations. It reveals that there is no clear evidentiary basis for gender affirmation interventions, and evidence for puberty suppression and cross-sex hormone treatments is of such poor quality that no foundation exists for clinical decisions and informed consent. Now, that is signed by many, many psychiatrists, and it seems to me absolutely scandalous. Have either of you encountered this in your day-to-day activities?
I haven't at all. I did read that letter and the response from the RANZCP, and I thought it was, I don't know if I'm using the right word, but the response says, what does it say? Gender diverse is not a mental health condition. And then it goes on to say that trans and gender diverse people should have equal access to mental health care. So I'm not really quite sure. I'm not really quite sure if I've worded that badly or what, but you know.
And this is the knots and that these people tie themselves up in jumping through the hoops to maintain the fictions of their ideology. And the sentence you were referring to, I'll read it to you. It says, being trans or gender diverse is not a mental health condition, and the RANZCP unequivocally supports the rights of trans and gender diverse people to have equal access to safe and effective mental health care that is underpinned by dignity, empathy, and respect. Jill, what do you think?
Well, you're assuming that any other treatment that a psychiatrist would engage in would be not respecting somebody's dignity. Now, if you have anorexia, you don't affirm the anorexia and saying, "Oh, that's good. Let's not eat anything. Let's just continue to go down to 30-something kilograms," and they wouldn't do that. But that doesn't mean that they don't do treatments that would respect the dignity of the person suffering from anorexia, as an example. And they just tried to sneak it through the Mental Health Act too. We made a submission on that. They're changing the Mental Health Act. And they're trying to say that if you have a gender identity, they won't call it a disorder, of course, but that would not be grounds for considering that they need to be, treated. So that's right. They tie themselves up in knots. Now, this whole issue about equal access, I didn't realise how important that was. When we were in the Labour Party in 2022, we were considering a remit which was asking for people who are transgender to have equal access, a better availability to gender reassignment surgery. And I was convening a women's network meeting in Auckland with over 100 Labour women, and we all agreed that should have an age limit on it, so that would apply to people over the age of 18. And actually, there was a huge reaction from the hierarchy of the Labor Party for us to remove that amendment before it even got to debate. And the person who submitted it on our behalf acquiesced and did so. So it never got to the conference floor. So it went through without any age limit. So the official policy of the Labor Party is that people should have access to gender reassignment surgery because of this issue about equality. Now, actually, there's a couple of issues there because internationally, these activists, many of whom are actually paedophiles, want to remove any such age limits, want to have it so that there are no age lower limits on these issues. So we didn't see it in that respect because we were kind of naive about it. The other thing about it is that, why should they? This is cosmetic surgery. Who gets equal access to cosmetic surgery?
Yes, and taxpayer funded as
elective,
well.
That's right,
Yes.
taxpayer funded and elective surgery. I mean, I know people who are waiting years for knee surgery and hip surgery who are suffering huge pain. And do they get rights to equal access?
Yeah.
You do have to wonder about that. Why should gender reassignment surgery be considered?
I think that I mean, I use the expression "they came like thieves in the night." I'm a bit dramatic about that. And they had insider help to start taking away, decimating women's rights, and to sort of start paving the way to make everything easier for them. We're talking about TQ plus, and they just, their presentations, their narratives, and everything like this. I'm not praising them, but they are superb. They absolutely sort of twist, like get into people's heads and change their thoughts. All the thoughts that they thought they had once had about reality, about life and everything. They start reading these narratives, talking to these people, and they just turn them around completely. It's just,
they certainly do. And a good example is that Jill just used the term, which is using their language, and they're very, very dedicated to controlling the language.
Yes.
Jill just used the term gender reassignment surgery. There's no such thing as gender reassignment surgery. All there is mutilation through cosmetic surgery. And, let's call it what it is. It's a mastectomy, for example, or it's eunuch type surgery. And you're right. And this is why they absolutely spit tax and lose their minds whenever people refuse to use their pronouns. If the trans rights activists and the apparatchiks in the Labour Party who are wedded to queer theory had their way, it would be a hate crime to refer to someone with a pronoun other than what they would choose to be addressed as in this country. And so I'm sure you guys are like me that, as much as possible, I try to avoid using their language so that we can have a reality-based discussion.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the Women's Rights Party, when we were putting through our remit last year on our policy proposals, so there was one in relation to all this, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones. And we ended up having lots of debates about the language that should be used. And in terms of gender reassignment surgery, we did call it, there was a suggestion of having mutilation in the term. We used cosmetic surgery, and our policy actually recognises that you can't actually change your sex. It's in every single chromosome in your body. And in fact, if you read the descriptions from men who've undergone vaginoplasty, I won't go into it because it is so gross. They wish they'd never done it because it's just a lifelong battle to keep it open. Shall I just say that much?
Oh, goodness gracious, you're right.
It's just outrageous. And like you said before, the medical council can't do anything about it. Well, actually they could. They could and they should. I have a friend whose brother-in-law was who's died following that surgery in the UK, and there is a class action suit involving others who had bad outcomes from the same surgeon. And I'm sure that's what we're going to see. We're going to see more and more lawsuits. Won't be probably necessarily in New Zealand because our avenues are limited because of our ACC regulations and all the rest of it.
For those who don't know, for those who may be watching overseas, New Zealand has a relatively unique approach to negligence and liability law. We have this no-fault system, which is sort of like a state insurance thing called ACC, Accident and Injury Corporation, I think is the acronym. And so it is very, very difficult for us to launch legal cases in cases of negligence and sue the culprits or the perpetrators. Instead, this no-fault system pretty much intervenes, and that's what Jill is referring to.
Yes, you can make a complaint under the health and disability legislation.
And I agree with you, Jill. I agree with you, Jill, that the medical council could and should, but I would suggest to you that they won't, because this is what we are seeing from our Human Rights Commission, from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we're seeing from the Medical Council, is that all of these organizations are absolutely captured by this ideology. And I think that one of the hopes that I have for 2025 is that there is an international trend away from wokery. It is being rejected around the world, and we're seeing that with things like the election of Trump, the problems that Keir Starmer's Labour Party is facing in Great Britain. And I'm hoping that New Zealand will be a follower of some of those trends, and that those sorts of external influences will have an impact upon some of these authorities and organizations inside the bureaucracy. Because I don't know about you guys, but I am not seeing enough from the coalition government to change these things. I'm not seeing them do anything like enough to hold people accountable for introducing this stuff without a mandate. And I also don't think that we have too many allies grassroots wise from other institutions such as the media. What do you think?
Oh, definitely not the media. I mean, we put out, I think I sent you a list of 20-something media releases that we made, and some of them were should have been of interest to the media because they were quite bizarre, like Health New Zealand not being able to define menstruation. But they only tend to get picked up by the platform, and Sean Plunkett and has been really good on these sorts of issues, and Reality Check Radio, and that's it. Other than getting the word out through Substacks and other sorts, podcasts and so on, and we're actually starting our own Substack. And I think there's been a change in the way people access their media, and particularly younger people. And so I don't think I think the mainstream media is almost irrelevant these days. Who listens to Radio New Zealand anymore?
I think you're absolutely right, and the media is shifting in that regard. And good on RCR and good on the platform for leading the charge on these issues. But you're right, it is changing. A lot of information is now disseminated via social media, and there's a lot of great work happening on Substack. And I think we should probably look at one of those articles now, which is the other day. I just thought this was fantastic that Katrina did a summary of 2024 and some of the issues that stuck out for her. And Katrina, I love this, and I'm sure lots and lots of people read it.
Yeah, well, it was just a roundup of what I had put on my own Substack. So there are some other things that aren't in there, obviously, the stuff that Jill's written for the Women's Rights Party and things like that, and other bits and pieces. And about the resist gender education, I've pretty much left the education thing up to them because, they do great work there. But, when I go and do my roundup, I mean, last year's was bad enough, and this year I've grown. It takes about 3 days to do it, to sit down. There's so much going on. I look at it, I think, oh my goodness. I thought, did I really write 85 pieces last year about this? And now I've got to go through them and do a roundup and put them in some sort of order. And
well, I admire your dedication, and you certainly are prolific. But coming to Jill's point, I think that is how a lot of this stuff is disseminated, right? Like a lot of people will read Katrina's work, share it out to their social media channels, and it kind of proliferates out into the world that way and circumvents the traditional media. Except with, the honourable exceptions, as you say, of new media type organisations like the Platform and RCR Radio. But to just go through some of your highlights, I thought I'd list those out for the audience who are listening and maybe can't see what's on screen. The first was the T-shirt which said "Men are not women, even if you can squint." I thought that was really cool. The second is the challenge to the wording of the Midwifery Council scope of practice. Now, this was a big one, and I'm sure you two were both heavily involved in this. What is progress like? It seemed to me from the outside looking in that the Midwifery Council were intransigent and were simply just prepared to make any little cosmetic changes without actually changing the substance of their intention to remove terms like women and babies from that scope of practice. What's the state of affairs there?
So the next step is they're now putting it into the guidelines for training midwives, and it's gone to the next step, the competencies that is required of midwives. So it's the juggernaut is continuing, and at the same time, the leading New Zealand international breastfeeding organisation, La Leche League, has gone down the same route, requiring the La Leche League leaders to assist men to breastfeed, chest feed, whatever, their babies. And so there is some fight back and resistance within La Leche League leaders. I was one for many years, but it's just unbelievable. So the Bible for breastfeeding is called The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding. Used to be called that. It's now called The Art of Breastfeeding. And it's just so bizarre that you would put autogynephile's desires above the needs of the mother and baby.
It is astonishing. And Katrina, what are you hearing from midwives who are being forced by their governing body to participate in this male fetish?
Well, I think some of them are actually on board with it. As I said, the narrative around this has all been so superb that it's really turning people's minds around. It's got that power to do that. It's so persuasive, so well put together that you look at it, read it, and think that you cannot actually see anything wrong with it. And that's how clever it is. Now, this scope of practice there's no decision has been made on it. It went to select committee. No decision has been made on it. But as Jill said, the Midwifery Council are going ahead and putting it into just going ahead with it as though it is put in place and settled.
That's right.
Oh, well, it's Jill, what are you hearing from inside, because you were involved with this organisation at so many levels. How is it that actual women can be promoting this nonsense?
Yeah,
that's $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Oh, a lot of women are pretty disgusted by it all, but it's quite difficult for people to speak out. It's difficult for midwives, particularly midwives who are employed by Health New Zealand, to speak out. Just before I retired, was it last year? Yeah, or the year before. Lost track of time. We went into negotiations with Health New Zealand for the employed midwives collective agreement. Now, everybody covered by that collective agreement is a woman, right? There are a handful of male midwives in New Zealand, but they tend to gravitate towards managerial levels and are therefore not covered by the collective agreement. So Health New Zealand came with just one claim, and that is to remove any references to she from the collective agreement we had, she, in some cases she/he, in the collective agreement. They wanted to make it gender neutral. It's just biggest belief. Too bad about the fact that we've got a shortage of midwives and they're probably not getting paid as much as they should. That's not an issue for Health New Zealand. What is an issue for Health New Zealand is that we ensure that we're gender neutral, so-called.
Yeah.
So it's just, I think that was probably the last straw for me when I decided, I'm out of here.
All right. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the RSE guidelines. This is the relationship, sexuality, and education, which has been under the far left government of that New Zealand kicked out of office in 2023. Effectively a grooming charter. And I'll bring that article up now because the evidence, the evidence from the Educational Review Office had a bunch of recommendations, and I wanted to go through them, but I've actually, it looks like I haven't found it, but basically it was I haven't got it correctly logged here, but it was recommendation 6 in it, and I'll look for it in a moment, was that schools currently are required to liaise with parents and with the school community about what they are teaching children every 2 years. And yet the Education Review Office, in response to all of the concerns about the grooming inside those materials, has put down as one of their proposals that those discussions with the community and that permission from parents be absolutely moved from the requirements. And it seems to me that this is just teachers' unions in particular looking to press their ideology and hiding from parents and families what it is they're exposing children to.
Yeah, it's too hard. It's too hard because the parents don't really like it when they get to be consulted about these guidelines, and it causes division in the community. That's the excuse. But what we heard, and in particular, Katrina referred to the meeting that we had in Christchurch, is that parents want to know, want to be involved in what's being taught to their children at school. And when they find out, they're pretty horrified, actually, as to what was in those guidelines. So I do want to say that I think that, and the solution of Erica Stanford is to have a standard curriculum, and therefore there's no need to consult, just like you don't consult over how you teach mathematics to children. I do need to say that our position as the Women's Rights Party is that we actually think that sex education in school is a good thing. We think that even with young children, they need to be taught about bullying, for example, and about healthy relationships, friendships, that is, and how to manage their feelings and how to protect their personal safety. For example, bad touching and inappropriate behaviour, and who they should talk to if they are experiencing such abuse. So those things we think is okay. We don't think there's any need to teach human reproductive systems until children are experiencing puberty, and then you would talk about the changes that they will be experiencing in puberty. You do wonder whether some of the anxiety that young adolescents are feeling about their sex and is due to the fact that they're getting really strange messages within their
I think you're right. I think you're right, Jill. I think a big part of this social contagion is the indoctrination into gender and rainbow ideology, which is occurring in schools. I found the section and I've highlighted it here, and I'll quote it to you. Consider replacing the requirement on school boards to consult the school community on RSE as part of the health and physical education curriculum with a requirement to inform parents and whānau. Whānau is the Maori word for family, about what they plan to teach and how they plan to teach it before they teach it. Schools should continue to take steps to understand students' needs. Schools should also ensure that parents in whānau know that they can withdraw their children from any element of RSE that they are uncomfortable with. This looks to me to be the Education Review Office saying, we want to indoctrinate children and we don't want parents to have any say in what we are doing. Does it read like that to you?
So it doesn't go far enough, does it? It should be saying that we don't want inside out and Qtopia, these organisations in our schools. And at the same meeting that we were talking about before, parents were saying about how, inside out or those organisations come in, the teacher's not even there in the classroom.
Yeah.
They're flouncing around. The woman who was talking about her son was in the front row. He was so uncomfortable with the way that the instructor was presenting himself that he refused to go back into that class, and she went to talk to the dean, and it turned out she wasn't the only one. So we need to get that out. We need teachers to have proper training in terms of sex education, and we need a reframing of the purpose of that, to talk to what consent means, for example. And also, I think the children these days, or young adolescents, need to be taught that what they see in terms of pornography is not natural, healthy sex. It's not healthy relationships. I mean, strangling your partner, as we even see on Netflix movies, is not normal sexual behaviour. And girls should not have to put up with it, and boys should not be doing it. And for that
I think
reason,
you're actually right. But coming back to the vetting issue, I put in a question about some of those extremist rainbow organisations that have unfettered access and unsupervised access to children in New Zealand schools, to the Ministry of Education to ask, what vetting are these people subject to before they are given unrestricted access to talk about these subjects with children? And the message came back to me that there is none. The Ministry of Education does not track visits from those organisations into schools and does not vet them. That is left as the responsibility of the school boards themselves, because the school boards, that power has been devolved to them. So there is no record of what these people are saying to children, whether or not they are supervised, and what the backgrounds of these people are. And let's not kid ourselves about what their agenda is. I think everyone knows that they're very, very close to being, if not outright paedophilic, paedophile adjacent. And a good example of that is this next article that I thought I would get you to comment upon, Katrina, which is a big thing. It's a big part of queer theory, and what the rainbow organizations are pushing is to normalize and destigmatize minor attracted persons, is the euphemism that they use. It's a euphemism for paedophilia. And this happened inside one of our academic institutions over the last 12 months, with Victoria University conducting surveys and studies to develop strategies to destigmatize paedophilia amongst the New Zealand community. Katrina, did you see this stuff?
I did, yes. I mean, what can you say about it? It's just astounding. I'll just want to make one comment before I sort of carry on about what you were talking about before in the schools, is that they, when you go to ask for content about what they teach, from Inside Out, Qtopia, etc., they claim they can't provide it because of copyright issues. So that is, so that's a real problem. And I would suggest that there's a lot of this going on, this copyright issue sort of stuff. And even if we're talking about this survey here for the university, and this is done by the university. So there may be a situation where you can get the information or something like that. But then what if they decide to come and get an outside organisation to do the survey and run it and all that sort of thing, paid by the university? You would never have be able to get access to what they've, maybe the information they've collated or anything like that, if they decide not to publish it. if they
Well,
want
yes,
to.
it's a deliberate strategy, right? They hide behind copyright law so that they don't have to share the materials, because they know that there will be objections from parents and from the general public if the content of that material is made public. What all of these organizations, all of these people are looking to do is to indoctrinate children and groom them and to keep it quiet. I mean, it just seems to be institutionalized pedophilia. It's how pedophiles have operated for decades, and it's like an industrial machine to do it. Would that be a fair assessment, Katrina, or am I exaggerating?
Why would you want to do a survey, even do a survey like this, if you hadn't sort of got some outside organization or some influence from somewhere pushing you to do it, a survey like this, and collate information and stuff like that to be able to pass on? I mean, I don't know. I'm just guessing, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some influence behind this, some money perhaps, to collate this kind of information and under the guise of a survey, collate it, package it up, and give it to interested parties.
I just want to go back to your question that you posed before, Simon, about the vetting of people working with children. So our international people who are watching may not realise that across New Zealand, anybody who works with children, nurses, midwives, social workers, anybody has to be vetted to ensure that they don't have a history of paedophilia or child sex abuse. And that's obviously a safety measure. So it does beg a belief that they allow, that these people are allowed to come into our classrooms without being vetted first. But of course, we also have drag time story hour. I bet they're not vetted either.
No, I don't believe they are. No, from what I understand, they're not.
All right. Well, two other issues I wanted to talk about before we wind up the episode. The first is what potential there is for repealing New Zealand's horrendous self-ID laws, and what is happening in the surrogacy space. Would either of you care to discuss, to express an opinion on those two subjects?
Oh, I'll let Jill do the surrogacy because she's been pretty thorough about that. But sex self-ID, I think that we would love to repeal that, but I think there's a snowball's chance in hell at the moment of doing that. It's turned the birth certificate just into a vanity document. I have heard that a woman, I think once upon a time, the birth certificate could be used as standalone identification for people, especially overseas. And now I think they need hospital records as well if they want to apply for residency or anything like that, like in the UK, because of sex self-ID, making their birth certificate unreliable.
You're exactly right. And just I do have some information on that. Yes, if you want to get a residency permit or you want to extend your visa in most of the Schengen countries, they no longer accept a New Zealand birth certificate as an official document.
Right. Yeah. So so that's clarified that. Yeah. And technically, like sex self-ID, changing your sex on the birth certificate, most people don't realize this, but it is not, you do not have to take that as confirmation of a person's sex, their birth certificate anymore. There's a lot of confusion around it, and some service providers may think that if a person's got a changed birth certificate, you then have to treat them like that, the sex it says on there. You do not have to do that. You can just take other factors into account, and those other factors just may be what your ears and eyes tell you. That could be as simple as that. But what it also does, it just heft to social sex self-ID or social self-ID, unfortunately. So we would have to start working on repealing it at some stage. But as I said, right now, there's probably a snowball's chance in hell of getting anywhere with that.
Okay, all right. Well,
it is our official policy as the Women's Rights Party to repeal self-sex ID and to take gender out of conversion therapy practices legislation as well. However, we have to remember that when sex self-ID went through Parliament, every single MP in Parliament at the time voted for it. Now, to be fair, New Zealand First was not in Parliament at the time, but the other two coalition partners were, and they all voted for it.
Yeah.
There were 8 people who didn't vote for the conversion therapy practices bill when it went through, and some of them were in ACT, possibly national as well. So, but that's been one of the arguments about why we need to put it in other legislation, like the Human Rights Act, because it's already there in self-sex ID and conversion practices. I don't necessarily buy that, but anyway. So, yeah, I think we do need to work on our local MPs about repealing that sex self-ID.
Oh, I do too. And coming to the surrogacy issue, I've just brought up an article from Radio New Zealand, which talks about the submissions on it. And there's one here from you, Jill, which says, Jill Ovens spoke on behalf of the Women's Rights Party and shared views about how best to protect the rights and needs of those acting as a surrogate. You might recall this political and philosophical input. What can you tell us about the submission process and what is happening in the field of surrogacy?
So, first of all, Timothy Coffey, when he was a Labour Party MP, and he is he's a parent of 2 children born by surrogacy with his partner Tim. They found that the current process of adoption, whereby the baby is born, it's legally the birth mother's child until it's adopted by the intending parents. They found that to be too long, and they didn't like the fact that they had contributed towards the genetic material of the child. So they wanted to relax, basically, the surrogacy legislation in New Zealand. And that's not something that only New Zealand's doing, of course. They're trying to do it in the UK and other jurisdictions. In our view, that sort of Radio New Zealand mention of our submission kind of doesn't get to the whole story, because we're opposed to surrogacy as the commodification of women. And we particularly want to keep commercial surrogacy as illegal in New Zealand. However, we point out that the fertility clinics that do the work that allows for surrogacy to happen are in fact commercial organisations. And this allows people with means, particularly gay male couples, to access surrogacy through their services because they've got the income, the money, and the women who take part in it, though they don't technically get paid to be a surrogate mother, they do get their expenses covered, etc. But we're also totally opposed to international surrogacy. And we're quite concerned because although international surrogacy in Thailand it's not legal to have commercial surrogacy arrangements currently in Thailand, but apparently they are looking at making it legal to have commercial surrogacy, and we know it goes on. And although we do have some protections in terms of when you try to bring the surrogate child back to New Zealand, they don't have guaranteed rights of entry into New Zealand, as they're not New Zealand citizens, and they have to go through a process. But yeah, we did raise points about protecting the rights of the women who are surrogates, because that's part of the story that gets completely missed in all this. And we were the only ones who submitted oral submissions to the Select Committee that took that position.
Wow. And so who were the organisations taking an opposing point of view?
Oh, there was an individual lawyer who's been involved in, surrogacy arrangements. There was a guy who was supportive, who himself had gone through the process. Yeah, so this is wending its way through Parliament. But the point is that the coalition government didn't have to pick it up. It went through when it was presented initially as a private member's bill by Tamati Coffey, and then the Labor government picked it up as a government bill, but it hadn't gone through by the time of the election, and it could have just laid there with about 50 other pieces of legislation that didn't go through at the time. But ACT picked it up and are now promoting it through Parliament. So it's very disappointing, because the current process, which is the birth mother should be the legal parent of that child, at least in the first instance. And Tamati Coffey's bill, the original bill, actually took that right off her.
Yes, well, I think that's taking rights away from people is certainly par for the course, it would seem to me, with that man. All right, well, guys, it is thoroughly depressing to talk to you two on these issues, because when we sort of look at it, it's really quite confronting. There's battles on so many fronts and an awful lot to be done.
Well, we've got good news. 2025, the Women's Rights Party is bringing over Vaishnavi Sundar, who has made a movie, Behind the Looking Glass, which raises issues about trans widows and the outcome for family members. So of having somebody who decides that they once was their husband and father, now wants to be called mum. And so we're bringing her over at the end of March, early April. And then later on in the year, very exciting, we're bringing Helen Joyce over to New Zealand.
That will be wonderful.
Yeah, the most articulate person on this planet on these issues.
Yeah,
so
it's great. Yeah. And I will say that there is something that men might consider doing as far as women's single-sex spaces go, believe it or not. But I have run this past someone who, gives me legal advice, and they did say, didn't say, it was a winner or anything like that. They sort of, there's potential, there's possibility here, but men may be able to get together and file a case of discrimination against the Christchurch City Council or any other councils about not allowed access to single-sex women's spaces if they don't say they're woman, whereas men who do say they're woman are allowed access. What's the difference? Why should men who say they're woman be allowed in, but not men who don't say they're woman? So there's potential there for men to do something, but it's time, effort, and money.
Right. A lot of people think that if we provided, councils, for example, provided unisex spaces in addition to the single-sex spaces, that would solve the problem. And it would be useful for those men who want to bring their children into getting changed, their young daughters, for example, which they can't really access the women's changing sheds. But it doesn't solve the problem of these men who want to be seen as women, because that is part of their philia.
That's all what it's all about.
That's how they get their rocks off, is by coming into the women's spaces. They won't use the unisex spaces. That's part of the problem, and so we.
But anyway, as I said, there's something that men can do if they feel inclined to do so.
And I should say that about a third of the members of the Women's Rights Party are men too. And I did ask one of the men, who was obviously a Trump supporter, and we do identify as being, more to the left than some of the other parties around. And I asked him why he joined the Women's Rights Party, and he said, because I've got an 8-year-old daughter and I don't want the stuff being taught to, he didn't say stuff, but I won't use the word he said, being taught to her in class. So, a lot of men are really concerned about these issues as well, for the protection of the women and their families and their daughters.
I'd put it to you that more men are concerned about women's rights than women are.
Probably. We have had an amazing, we call them our platform guys, we have had amazing response from men when we're interviewed on the platform in particular, and RCR.
Good, good. All right. Final thoughts, Katrina. What are you hoping for from 2025?
What I'm hoping for really is more collaboration, which will create more momentum and more visibility about this issue.
And Jill?
Well, one of the things I forgot to mention is that every week there is Pride Week or Rainbow this or Rainbow that, and Parliament flies rainbow flags. And it is a bit of a shame because we've got nothing against the traditional rainbow flag. It's the pizza flag that we're objecting to. But you never see women's suffrage flag fly, not even on suffrage day.
True.
And so one of the things we're going to do this year is to launch a petition to have a public holiday on suffrage day, September the 19th. And at the very least, to fly a suffrage flag over Parliament. We go up there every year on suffrage day with a very small flag, and we fly our own little wee flag. But for goodness sake, this country was the first in the world to give women the vote, and we won't even acknowledge it. So
that's a great point. That's a great point. I mean, it's part of our social history as being the first country in the world to give women the vote. And yet, you're right, it is just unconscionable that we don't recognize that. Well, I tell you what, if you're selling carnations with the suffragette colours, I would certainly buy and wear one. Oh, well, look.
Camellia. I just have to correct you. It's camellias.
Camellias. And we actually crochet camellias and we give them out. Yeah.
All right. Well,
good on you.
Ladies, thank you very much for joining me, and it's been really interesting to get your view on some of these issues. I think that as we go throughout the year, it would be wonderful to have you back on to speak about particular issues, and we were quite broad strokes today because we covered so much ground. It would be nice if the three of us could gather again and maybe look to dig into one or two issues a little bit more specifically, if you're amenable to that.
Yep, that sounds good, Simon. Yep.
Yeah, that sounds good. I sent Simon a list of 20 issues that I wanted to talk about. He said, whoa.
I did. It was a little bit overwhelming. All right. Well, look, I'll say good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining me. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Guys, you've been watching Polity World with Katrina Biggs and Jill Ovens.